Good evening, everybody. My name is Bert Dicht. I am Managing Director of Membership for the National Space Society. And on behalf of my colleague, Larry Ahern, Vice President of Chapters, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our NSS Space Forum this evening, Navigating the Florida Space Coast Rocket Landscape. And I know we've got a lot of things to discuss tonight. I know you're going to enjoy the discussion. So again, welcome to the forum. I want to share our agenda for the evening. As always, I just go over a little bit of virtual etiquette. I've got a few announcements concerning the National Space Society. Then I'll be talking about some upcoming space forums and town halls. And then I will introduce our guest speaker for the evening. And of course, then we'll close out for the night. As always, in terms of asking questions, it's best to use the Q&A function because that goes directly to our speaker, and it makes it a lot easier to pull those questions out. Also, you certainly feel free to use the chat function to put in a question or to comment. We just ask that you be respectful of all of our panelists and the audience as well. A number of questions were submitted beforehand. And I did pass them on to our speaker tonight, so they might be, a lot of them will probably be addressed during her presentation, but we'll hope to get to as many as possible. Always, as I say before, if you're enjoying programs like this, our space forums and town halls, please donate to support NSS. I will post this link into the chat. I really do appreciate all the support we've received since we started these programs, and we hope to get your donations again, and we thank you in advance for doing that. Also, please complete the post-Space Forum survey. It really helps us in planning these events coming in the future. The survey is anonymous. It's going to appear right after you close out the session tonight, and it'll only take a couple minutes to complete. So thank you in advance also for doing that. A few announcements about things that are upcoming here. I will be talking about the ISDC pretty much at every one of our future space forums up until the ISDC, but I just want to try to give you a heads up as to what's happening. So I'll highlight a couple of different speakers each time. Of course, the ISDC will be held in Los Angeles from May 23rd to 26th at the Sheraton Gateway, Los Angeles. The theme is No Limits in Space. Last week, I profiled a couple of astronauts who will be joining us, but we have some other great speakers. Of course, Alan Stern, who was a guest on one of our space forums last year, and also Rob Manning, the JPL chief engineer. Those are just two of the many, many great speakers we're going to have at the ISDC. So join us. It's the 42nd annual ISDC. Members do receive a discount on the registration, and the early bird registration ends on the 31st of March. So you really want to get in there and take care of that right away, and also make your hotel reservations as soon as possible. It promises to be a really, really good ISDC. So hope to see you there. I made my registrations last week, so we'll see you in Los Angeles. Also, coming up this Saturday, this is unique. We've got a special edition Space Forum coming up on Saturday morning. Now, see the time there, 9:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And the reason it's early is because we're going to have guests from all over the world. This is a Spun Debates University Mentor Forum. And our special guest is John Mankins, who's also, of course, a board of director member for the NSS, but he's the founder and president of Mankins Space Technology, a long-term NASA employee, and a recognized expert in space solar power. And the reason we have these mentor forums, it's to actually help the students who are participating in what's called the Spun Debate program. These are teams of international high school and university students. They compete in these debates on different topics related to space development, space settlement, and space exploration. The reason John is going to be talking to them is the resolution this year is the international community must establish regulations for space-based solar power to mitigate potential hazards. So the idea is we bring in an expert to give the students some background on these topics. It's not about taking a position. They just give the students background, and then the students can ask questions. It helps them prepare for the debates. I actually served as a mentor a few times. I've also been a judge. I can tell you these are incredibly talented students. So if you can make it on Saturday morning, it would be great. So you'll be able to hear John give an introduction, and then the students will be able to ask their questions. And the Spun Debate tournament will take place in April, and then the finals will take place at the ISDC on the on May 25th and in Los Angeles. So hope you can join us. You should have received an invite for this in your email, but I also will post a registration link into the chat. And last thing is coming up, and this maybe is more for those who are local in here on the Space Coast, but our Florida Space Development Council, the chapter for NSS, is co-hosting what we're calling 321 Day with the American Space Museum. And it's really a big event to honor Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy was an icon of Spaceview Park. If you know familiar with Titusville, it's a great place to view all the launches. But he's also the father of what's called 321. If you called our office, it's a 321 area code. And that was because of Ozzy's efforts to get the area code changed. So he passed away. Ozzy passed away last August. They're doing this special 321 Day. This is going to be an annual event coming forward to honor Ozzy. And it's really, really going to be a fun day. Gabriel Rothblatt from our Florida Space Development Council, Hannah Renz also, and of course, Jennifer Muntz from our office. They've been heavily involved in planning this. So if you're in the area, we definitely encourage you to come by. It's Thursday, March 21st. Starting at 3:21 p.m. So you see the theme there, but hopefully you can make it. And I'll put this into the chat so you have a chance to look it over. And hopefully, if you are in the area or can make a trip down, we welcome you there. So looking forward to that. So those are the main announcements. I did want to touch on what's coming up with the Space Forums. Again, this one on March 16th. So hopefully you can join us. We have another one on April 11th. It's going to be a town hall that is going to focus in on the ISDC 24. And we do hope to have several presenters with us to talk about what they'll be talking about at the ISDC. There's going to be another one on April 25th, still working on the topic. And I just locked in on May 9th, the launch director's perspective from Bob Seek, who launched upwards of 80-some space shuttles as a launch director for NASA. So that should be really interesting. Working on a couple of other great topics. We might have another one coming up on the 28th, 2 weeks from today. I'm still working it, but we'll definitely let you know about that well in advance so you can plan for that. So it's going to be a fun year for our space forums and town halls. And now, as I move into our program, it's again always my great pleasure to introduce the National Space Society CEO, Anita Gale. Anita, would you just like to say a few words of welcome?
Well, of course. And we need to thank Bert and Larry for putting together these amazing Space Forum and Town Hall programs, which are really wonderful member benefits. So we really appreciate that. This is an especially interesting topic for me. I used to work on the Space Shuttle program. I'd get down to the Cape and wander around launch pads every once in a while. And something that is a little known fact that we in the launch business know is that launching or having more launches, increasing to the number of launches, the frequency of launches we have now, it's not just a matter of putting more stuff on the pad and doing the countdown down and away you go. There was a time we would not be able to launch or do 2 launches in a week because the range, which is managed by Patrick Air Force Base south of the Cape and is responsible for keeping track of launches, making sure everyone's safe, the range could not reconfigure quickly enough. So there's a lot more that goes behind these increasing launch rates than most people not in the industry would know. So it's, for me, it's pretty amazing because this could not have happened when I was in my career. So Laura, looking forward to hearing you tell us what's coming on.
Very good. Thank you, Anita, again for joining us again. I will get back to sharing my screen as I introduce our guest speaker for the evening. So there we go. So a lot of you might remember our guest speaker, Laura Forczyk. She actually spoke at our Space Forum back in June in 2022. So it tells you how long we've been working on these things. And she did a great presentation on becoming off-worldly, about preparing for your own future spaceflight journey. So she has a great book out that is out there now, and would definitely encourage you to take a look at that. And you can also look at the recording of the Space Forum from 2 years ago. So that's a great way to introduce tonight's topic with Laura, where she is going to be talking about what's happening here on the Space Coast. Laura is the founder and executive director of the space consulting firm Astralytical. She has a lot of experience working here at the Space Coast. And as I mentioned, the Florida Space Development Council, Laura was actually a past president of that chapter. And we just talked a little bit about that before getting on to the presentation tonight. So I think you're going to find her presentation very interesting. The reason I had reached out to her, she had been quoted in the Florida Today paper about all the recent events here, and I thought it was really topical to have her give us a breakdown of what's going on. So I'm going to stop my share here and welcome Laura. It's great to have you, and ready to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bert, and thank you, Anita. Thank you both for the invitation to join tonight. And I see some familiar faces in the audience, some people I haven't seen in quite some time. So I see you. Thanks for coming. Today has been quite an exciting day. I admit I'm exhausted because I have been talking to reporters, and it has been an exciting day. For those of you who don't know, Starship is planned to launch from the Cape. So I am going to be discussing Starship a little bit later. But just so you know, like, I personally think that was a totally successful flight today, except for reentry and, the landing attempt. So up until that point, yeah, I think they had a relight issue after SECO, but otherwise, spectacular takeoff, spectacular separation, tested that propellant transfer, tested the opening and closing of the doors. I mean, that went so well. And so I'm really impressed with the SpaceX team. I'm really optimistic about Starship. Just fantastic day for human spaceflight, or spaceflight in general, I should say. When we think about launches from the Cape, who dominates? And this is an interesting topic because 10, 15 years ago, the answer would be really different from today. 10, 15 years ago, ULA, United Launch Alliance, and USA, United Space Alliance, dominated. USA was the contractor that worked with NASA to fly Space Shuttle. And ULA, of course, we know them as launching the Delta IVs, the Atlas Vs. They were the dominant ones. And now, if you ask somebody who hasn't been around for ages, who's the dominant one on the space flight, they won't even think of ULA. They don't even know about USA. They will think about SpaceX, because SpaceX is launching, I don't know what the rate is anymore. It was like 3 days, every 3 days last year. Someone can tell me what the current rate is. It's like every 2 to 3 days, they're launching Falcon 9s. It's amazing, because I remember when Space Shuttle retired and there were layoffs and there was depression and there were, secondary, effects from the layoffs, and people were moving out of the Space Coast to Florida. And there was just a ton of effort put in over years by Space Florida and by others in the community to turn that around. And so much of that effort is the reason why we see so much success today, not only with SpaceX, but with some of the other launch service providers I'm going to talk about. So I do want to talk about the launch vehicles, the ones that are currently operational, the ones that are going to become operational, and what launch complex they are launching from. And I'm going to use the blanket term Cape Canaveral to describe Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Kennedy Space Center, because technically they all fall under Cape Canaveral Spaceport. And I wrote these down so I don't get them confused, because if you look at a map, there is a bunch of spaceports, space launch complexes, but they're not all used. Some of them are historic. And so if you look at a map, you just might not even know which ones are operational, which ones are going to become operational in the future, and which ones are just done. And so I've written these things down. If you want to go pull up a map, go ahead and do that. And you can kind of follow along with the, where these things are, but it's not that important. I'm just doing it to add some context here. So first off, Falcon 9s, they launch mainly from Launch Complex 40 and 39A on the Cape. Now, they do also launch from Vandenberg, but I'm not going to be talking about Vandenberg. I'm not going to be talking about Kodiak in Alaska. I'm going to be talking about the Cape here. So they are launching, again, every like 2 or 3 days. I've lost track. Very impressive. Now, Falcon Heavy also launches from 39A, little less, very, very, very less frequently. And it's not anything technically wrong with Falcon Heavy. It's more like what payload goes with what vehicle. The Falcon 9 is the workhorse. The Falcon Heavy, they pull that out when they need to. And there hasn't been that many payloads that are needed for Falcon Heavy. So Falcon Heavy, to me, is an intermediary vehicle where there's Falcon 9 is the workhorse, and then there's Starship. And Falcon Heavy is that bridge, that temporary bridge between them, where Starship's not yet operational, and they have the capability of launching something higher than Falcon 9, something, more capable than Falcon 9, but they don't need it that often. So what we have is Starship that had its 3rd integrated test flight today. The FAA is going to start their investigation with SpaceX to certify for the next launch test flight, the orbital test flight, I should say. And I hesitate to give a guess as to how long that's going to take, but I think it'll take approximately the same length of time as the previous investigation, if not a little bit shorter, because I don't believe that there was any damage to any pad or infrastructure, and I don't believe that anything was risky to the uninvolved public, which is what the FAA looks for. So I do think that we're going to have a somewhat quick turnaround. Oh no, not as quick as Elon Musk wants, I'm sure. I'm sure he's going to put out tweets saying some date, some aspirational date, and it won't be that quick. But I think that we are going to see some turnaround here where they are going to launch Starship multiple times this year. And they are launching out of Boca Chica, Texas. That is their facility where they're doing these test flights. But there is a EIS, an environmental impact statement process going on right now at Cape Canaveral, where the Air Force is actually looking to see what needs to be done to fly the Cape out of Cape Canaveral. And I find that interesting. Someone tell me why, if you know, why is it the Air Force and not the Space Force? But it is the Air Force that's doing that. Maybe it has something to do with the range. I'm not sure. But someone who knows, you can tell me. So what they're doing right now, it's actually going on as we speak. If you have any comments about wanting to fly, your opinions on flying Starship out of the Cape, they are accepting comments through March 22nd. So it's not too late to comment on that. They are considering either using 37, which is a launch pad that's currently being used by ULA. I'll talk about that a little later. ULA is not going to need that launch pad for much longer. And they are deciding that they don't need it. So they're going to either give it that to SpaceX for Starship to either modify it or use it as it is, or even demolish it and start over with some other infrastructure. Or they are going to build a brand new pad called Slick 50. And I'm going to say Slick sometimes here, and that means Space Launch Complex. So it's just a quick way of saying launch complex. So they might actually create a new complex, a new pad for Starship called 50. We're just going to have to see how this plays out. So that is the workhorse. That is what we are excited about today, as we just saw that test flight. There are, of course, a lot of others that are launching out of the Cape. SLS is the obvious one that NASA is launching. It's launching out of 39B right now. It launched Artemis 1 back in November of 2022. Artemis 2 is currently scheduled for September 2025. I would expect that to slip. How much it slips, I don't know. 2026 sounds good for me. Sure, let's go ahead and say 2026. I don't know when. We do have Artemis 3 scheduled for September 2026. At this point, that's not happening. I would guess 2027 or 2028. But either way, it's the SLS and the Orion capsule on top. And that is a human-rated vehicle. It will fly starting Artemis 2 with people on board. Really super excited about that mission. And you might notice with those dates, it's infrequent, right? NASA's not launching this very frequently at all. That has to do with the great expense and the time it takes to build and get get SLS operational. It's going to be a slow cadence until it's ultimately filtered out, which don't know when that's going to be. ULA, I did mention earlier, United Launch Alliance, they were the dominant force before SpaceX. ULA has two legacy vehicles from its combination of Boeing and Lockheed Martin background. So Boeing and Lockheed Martin at this time are joint owners of ULA. And ULA is currently still flying its two vehicles of Delta 4 Heavy's retired, but Delta 4 and Atlas 5. Now, Delta 4 has its last flight in 2 weeks, March 28th. And so that's what I was talking about with they no longer need that 37, that Slick 37 anymore after that flight. So if you are in the Cape, go ahead, check out the last Delta 4 flight. It'll be cool. You can say you saw the last one, and then they're done. Atlas 5 is also going to be wrapping up. So they have 17 left. They've sold all of them. Most of them are actually Amazon Kuiper, Project Kuiper launches. So they are launching out of 41. And then Vulcan. Oh my gosh, how many of you saw that amazing first flight of Vulcan in January 8th? That was really impressive. And because of the perfectionism of ULA and the high profile of that launch, I didn't expect anything else. I would have been surprised if something went catastrophically wrong, because the way that ULA operates and the way that SpaceX operates, for example, totally different. So while with SpaceX you expect the explosions, with ULA you definitely do not expect the explosions. And so Vulcan went on without a hitch in January out of Slick 41. I don't know off the top of my head when the next Vulcan flight is expected to launch. Now, speaking of ULA and Vulcan, Vulcan uses engines from Blue Origin, and Blue Origin is currently the rumored frontrunner to buy United Launch Alliance, which is for sale. So we might see in the future ULA being owned by Blue Origin, although it might not happen. So, don't count that as truth. But we do have Blue Origin currently about to launch, and about is an interesting way to put it, but they do have their New Glenn orbital vehicle. They have their New Shepard, which they've been launching out of Texas, which is a suborbital vehicle. But in the orbital realm, they've got New Glenn, and they had that on the pad. It wasn't a full flight ready vehicle on the pad, but they did have it on the pad earlier this year, I think back in February. I'm not sure if it's still there or not. I think they might have taken it back, but they had that on the pad on Launch Complex 36. So they do plan to launch that this year, currently scheduled for August of this year. They're going to launch a NASA mission. At least that's the current plan. I'm really excited to see that. I think that between Starship, SLS, New Glenn, and Vulcan, I mean, we've still got some really huge rockets that are going to make appearances. I'm going to talk about some smaller players now. Relativity Space. Relativity Space, unfortunately, did launch twice from the Cape and did not succeed. So I'm mixing them up with Astra. They launched once from the Cape and they did not succeed. So they launched back in March of 2023 and it failed. That was their Terran 1 vehicle. They do have plans now. They've already retired Terran 1. They have plans for a larger vehicle called Terran R, which they do plan to launch from the Cape, but not for a while yet, not until like 2026. So Relativity, they are launching successfully elsewhere. I think, is it Alaska? Someone can tell me if I'm wrong. But in terms of the Cape, they only had the one test flight and it failed. It wasn't a test. They had the one flight and it failed. Now, Astra, which I accidentally brought up just now, I got them confused. Oh, Astra. I could go off on a tangent about Astra, but all I can say is they did attempt to fly from the Cape twice in February 2022 and June 2022. Both of those failed. I'm honestly not sure what the future of the company holds. They've been struggling financially. They just went from public to private at a significantly decreased valuation. I don't know if they're going to be able to fly again. I honestly don't. So if they do, it would be cool to see. But, I don't know what the future holds with Astra if they're going to launch from the Cape again. But as of right now, they're still alive. So I'm going to keep them in there. Firefly Aerospace, they are launching elsewhere right now, but they do have plans to launch out of Launch Complex 20. And I don't know if I mentioned Astra's launching from 46. Those of you keeping track. And now I've got some other ones. Actually, all of these rest of these ones, they are planning to launch, but have not yet launched. And we don't really know when they're planning to launch from the Cape. So we have, again, Firefly Aerospace launching from 20. ABL Space is planning to launch from 15. Stoke Space is planning to launch from 14. And Phantom Space and Via Space are going to be launching on the same pad. They're going to share it of 13. If you don't know the name Space, you might know them under the name Rocket Crafters. So they changed the name a few years ago. So they have joint ownership or joint, not ownership, but permission to launch from 13. So that's the general landscape of the Cape. As you can see, it is quite diversified. And there are some players here which are not proven. There are some players that are risky. And that kind of, to me, a historian might be able to say differently, but to me, this tells me that it goes back to the days where spaceflight was fairly new and they took a lot of risks and they didn't really know how to properly launch reliably. And this was mostly, this was the government, right? This was the military. And so they launched a lot of failures. They blew up a lot of rockets. If you see those historic videos, they launched and they blew stuff up. And so I think that because that was so far in the past, I wasn't born when the space age started, that we just kind of forget that it used to be that way. And now it's gone from the government doing a lot of experimental rockets and blowing things up to now commercial companies doing a lot of experiments and blowing things up. And so it's sort of like history, not repeating, but echoing or rhyming, where now we do have these risky rockets, these experimental rockets, but it's commercial companies that are risking their own money, their stakeholder money to go ahead and try to launch from these historic launch pads. I find that super exciting. I don't want to talk too long. I actually want to open it up for questions. Bert, I know you have a ton of questions. I was saying it's like 3 hours worth of questions that you guys submitted. I appreciate that. So do you want to get to those, Bert? And I also want to open it up to the audience who's watching live. I appreciate you.
That sounds good, Laura. First question. Yeah, I didn't realize that they were planning to do Starship at another place beyond 39A, and you said possibly 37. Is there a safety radius that you need? Because those launch pads seem pretty tightly packed on Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And I know that's the reason they didn't build a launch pad for the Saturn V on Cape Canaveral, because they needed I think like 3 miles to the nearest people. So is that a requirement for Starship?
That's what they're looking at right now. They're trying to understand the safety requirements for Starship on the Cape. They have not come to conclusions yet. There aren't any firm numbers that I can tell you in terms of a safety radius. Maybe someone who's an engineer who can estimate that can tell you. I'm a scientist, not an engineer, so I can't even estimate that for you. But I can say that it's not going to launch from the Cape unless it's safe. And it might be that the future, because the Cape is so packed and because the Cape is historic, that it might be that we actually start launching things from the coast. And I know there's at least one company in the United States that's looking to launch things from the coast. So it might be that we make that transition. But as of right now, they're looking at 2 options on the land of the spaceport.
Right, because I know at this point, NASA required SpaceX to have another launch pad for taking astronauts to space. So 40 has just been completed to actually now carry astronauts as well on a Crew Dragon. So just because they were building that Starship launch pad also at 39A. So I think that's interesting. So there's a lot going on. I know we can go down some of the questions here, but you mentioned New Glenn. Is that one progressing? Along to their schedule, I guess. I know it's been delayed, but I know Blue Origin moves to whatever deliberate schedule. They're not in any race with anybody. At least that's what they say.
Yeah, so I have no reason to believe that they're not going to launch out of August, other than the fact that launches tend to slip. And that date was set sometime in the fall of last year. And so if you're looking almost a year out, dates slip. So that's the only reason why I would think that date would slip. I have no reason to believe that it's like seriously delayed to the point where they're going to have technical difficulties, because Vulcan went off so successfully. Now, Vulcan is a different rocket, but they use the same engines. And because those engines performed flawlessly, that gives me hope that New Glenn is going to do fairly well when they decide to launch it.
Right. Sounds good. I think I see one hand raised. Let me see if we can get that. Let's see. Brent is asking a question. I'm going to let him ask it for you. Let's see. I just need to. Okay, where is it? Brent, did you? It looks like their hand went down. Okay. Oh, he did not mean to raise his hand. There we go. Got it. So why don't I go into some of the questions that were submitted here? And first, let's give a little bit more background on your company here, because there were a couple questions about your company. And so what distinguishes Astralytical from other consulting firms in the space industry?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I always sort of forget to play up my company. So Astralytical is a boutique space consulting firm, and we have a totally remote team. It's a small team and it's data-based. So all of our team members have some science background, and it is very data-based. So it differs from a space consulting company that's more, based in economics or based in finance, or have lawyers. I mean, there's times and places where you want that, but ours is data-based, and we look to see how we can help companies grow. Traditionally, we've worked with a lot of startups, but we've also worked with NASA, with ESA, the European Space Agency, with the Space Foundation, and with other nonprofits. And so we work with them to help them grow in the space sector, specifically looking at market intelligence and customer discovery, customer insights, competitive landscape, and proposal evaluation and refinement, and helping them to also get used to, or get ready to fundraise. So, there's a really hard landscape right now for fundraising. It's really hard to find the money that from investors and VC firms. And so you really put your best foot forward and have that good luck to make sure that you get that that maximum chance of either winning that proposal or getting that kind of fundraising that you're asking for. So that's what Astralytical does. We really focus on the emerging space sector. So not so much like telecommunications, other companies handle that. And we really focus on the United States, although we do look globally. And I'm trying to pivot the company to things that I find most interesting, which is lunar, cislunar, spaceports, and space stations. So that's the area I'm trying to nudge the company in as we look forward into the future.
Great. You mentioned you're a scientist. What's the background of your team?
So my background is astrophysics and planetary science. I just hired a Martian geologist. We have someone who has an extensive background in military science and just actually finished a space commerce master's degree. I think space enterprise. Sorry, I don't remember the exact. It's from Florida Tech, whatever their master's program is called. We have a political scientist, so if that counts as science, I kind of count it as science, kind of not. I don't know. So we have a diverse team of people who come from backgrounds that you might not think of when you think about consulting companies.
We do have some people who are, I guess, are budding entrepreneurs, so they just wanted to know how did you get your company started?
Oh, that's an interesting backstory, because I never intended to start my own company. I was working out of the Cape, starting a branch of a startup. And as you well know, startups fail. And so I was the lone person trying to build up this branch of a startup, not my startup, somebody else's startup, and it failed. And so I did not know what to do. I was literally days away from giving birth to my first child. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to go apply for jobs right now. So what am I going to go do? I know how to consult. I'm going to part-time consult. And then the part-time consulting turned into full-time consulting, and I grew the team. And so it was very accidental.
That's great. And how did you get into writing some of the books that you've written?
I don't remember who said the quote, but write the books that you wish are written. And so that's what I've done. I'm currently working on a third book that takes the last chapter of this book here, and it expands upon it. So then the last chapter, I talk about making spaceflight accessible for people of all bodies. So I really want to talk about how we can deliberately design human spaceflight so that it can be representative of human society. So that is people with disabilities, people who are you need accommodations, people who are traditionally left out. I don't think that it is wise, if we want to say that space is for everyone, to then deliberately design space so it's not for everyone. So I want to just make sure that space is really opened up for all of humanity, if that's what we intend to do.
Great. There is a quote there from Gregory in the chat, and it leads into the question I have. There is an old saying that says you have to blow stuff up in the rocket business before they take you seriously. So, but I really want to bring up the concept of SpaceX, because I'm an engineer, and we're trained through the engineering design process. And we definitely try to tell students it's okay to fail, that you learn by failing. You go back and you become successful. And they are proving that out with a lot of what they do, especially with Starship. But the question is, how much longer can they keep blowing things up? Because again, I think certainly NASA could never do that. And I saw there was a test of a rocket in Japan just the other day that failed. There was a privately funded rocket. So can they keep doing this? I know they're learning a lot. Today was incredibly successful, but they still have a long way to go in order to make this work. And I'm just wondering about their, what's their staying power in this case?
They do have the staying power for quite some time. So they can continue to blow things up for quite some time, but that's not what they want, right? They want to have the next flight be successful or as successful as it can be, just as this flight today was more successful than the previous one. And the reasons why they can do this and NASA can't. I know before we started chatting during the presentation, before we started recording, Anita was talking about the difference with Space Shuttle and how from the very start, Space Shuttle was crewed. It had people on board, and these ones don't. And so they do have a little bit more freedom to blow things up because there's no harm that's going to come to somebody on board. They don't even have a mannequin on board like they did with Falcon Heavy. Another reason why NASA can't do this is because NASA is a government agency that has a big profile, and NASA's bosses, in a sense, are Congress. Congress decides the budget of NASA. And so when you have something go wrong with NASA, there are congressional hearings. Just like there was announced today, a congressional hearing next week on NASA's science missions, because suddenly science is being cut and NASA's delaying Mars sample return and all these things, the missions to Venus, Veritas and Da Vinci. And so like with all of the decisions NASA makes, there's Congress looking at them and Congress judging them. and so Congress has the ability to then punish NASA in a way if they decide to. Whereas there's a buffer between Congress and SpaceX where NASA has to hold SpaceX accountable because NASA is a very large customer of SpaceX. SpaceX needs to prove that its rockets are safe for NASA passengers and NASA payloads, especially in the passengers. So if you're thinking about, for example, the success of the Dragon, the Crew Dragon, if you remember when they were about to launch Demo 2 back in 2020, they took meticulous care. SpaceX took meticulous care to make sure that the rocket, the capsule, they were both ready to fly two people on board, two NASA astronauts on board. And they did. And then they continued doing it time and time again. And that's what we're going to see here when they're ready to fly for Artemis 3. It's because they made sure that it's meticulously ready. They're going to blow it up before they put people on board so that it is absolutely ready when they do put people on board.
Right. So that brings up a good question in terms of this perceived or so-called competition between SpaceX and Blue Origin. Can you comment on the differing approaches that Elon Musk has toward SpaceX and Jeff Bezos has toward Blue Origin?
Yeah, I feel like this was more of a big thing maybe 5 or longer years ago when they were sniping on Twitter.
Right.
I don't think it's as big of a deal anymore because they are going after some of the same customers, but a lot of different customers, and they've got different goals. So SpaceX, Elon Musk started SpaceX for the purpose of sending humans to Mars. That is the goal, right? And so all the things that it's doing to get there, participating in Artemis, sending people to the moon, doing Starlink and, having the huge mega constellation of Starlink and, all the DoD customers and all the other NASA payloads and all the commercial payloads, all of that is to get humans to Mars. Whereas Blue Origin, I think, has more of a diversified vision of humans living and working in space and lunar permanence and all the other things that it's working on behind the scenes. They're both approximately the same age and they both approximately have the same-ish number of employees working, but totally different approaches and totally different visions that are almost complementary, I would say. So yes, they're competitors, and a lot of people criticize Blue Origin for operating too slowly, for developing too slowly. And I think Jeff Bezos also was a little bit critical of its own company for going too slow, and they did make a CEO change. And it's going to be interesting to see once New Glenn is operational, if that does compete with anything SpaceX is doing, because New Glenn does have a significant number of Amazon Project Kuiper missions already booked up. It's going to be especially interesting if Blue Origin buys ULA, and then that's going to change the dynamic again. So yes, they're competitors, but I wouldn't say it's like direct competitors all the time. They sort of have a lot of overlap, but they also have a lot of different things that they're doing.
Right. Are they approaching the development of technology in similar ways?
No.
Oh, okay.
I don't think so. Maybe someone who works, for one of those two companies can say otherwise, but I think it's very different. Um, I'm not on the inside of either one of those companies, so I can only speak as an outsider. But
Right.
the mentality of SpaceX is crank it, push people to limits, break things and fix it and iterate and all of that. Whereas Blue Origin is a bit more on the slower, careful, cautious side of making sure that it delivered the BE4 engines to Vulcan, and that it's going to be ready not like tomorrow to launch New Glenn, but in August-ish time to launch New Glenn. It's taking its time. I guess the fire that's lit under SpaceX isn't exactly there with Blue Origin. I think that's one of the main differences.
Right. Let me go back to one of the questions that was submitted related to the Space Coast. Let's see. With the pickup in launches, what steps are being taken by NASA, the Space Force, and the rocket companies to protect the environment?
Oh, excellent question. This is not my expertise, but if you have ever been to the Cape, you will know that it's a wildlife refuge. And so you will see alligators, and you will see birds of all kinds, and you will see, there's an eagle's nest. I mean, like you will just see the wildlife surrounding you, because that's the way they designed it. They designed it so that the wildlife and the protection of the environment go hand in hand with the technology. And of course, we could be better at it. Of course, the environmental concerns are there, the way that the emissions interact with the environment, and the ways that we re-enter materials that then get dispersed in the environment. That's something that's fairly new that's come to our attention, where they've done studies to see how these vehicles and other bodies, other spacecraft that we re-enter into the atmosphere to burn up in the atmosphere, how it then affects the composition of the atmosphere, and it does affect it. And so we can be better in terms of the emissions of the rockets. We can be better in terms of recycling the materials, which is actually a legal thing as well as a technical thing. And so we have a lot of improvements to make. But in terms of the spaceport itself, I would say that they do a really good job of making sure that they protect the environment. And we haven't seen any, catastrophes in recent history that have affected the grounds at Cape Canaveral. I think it's probably different at some other places. I know that they've experienced some of that in Alaska at Kodiak Island, where they did have explosions on the ground. I'm just not an expert in that area to know how much it affected it. I know Boca Chica, Texas, of course, had the explosion with Starship last time they tested, but it ended up being mostly grains of sand and concrete, and not really anything that was too terribly bad for the environment. We're just going to have to be aware that as we go outward into the rest of the solar system, that we are protecting the only planet that we know of that has life. And astronauts who go up there, people who go up even for just a few minutes suborbitally, they see the thin atmosphere of Earth, and it changes their perspective, because they realize that Earth is fragile and we do need to take care of it. And so if we're going up there to protect humanity and to expand humanity, we need to make sure that we are doing it in a way that is responsible for the environment.
Great. There was another question, you kind of touched on it in a way about launching from other places, but the person asked, how can the Space Coast be replicated in other geographical areas? I know, obviously Texas is a place, Vandenberg's been around for a while. They're launching from Virginia now. So do you see other spaceports popping up?
I know that there's a lot of attempts, and there's also a lot of resistance. So I was part of 2 spaceport efforts in the United States and 1 in the Middle East. And only in the Middle East did the one get approved. There was an expansion, a commercial spaceport that wanted to be put in place above Cape Canaveral in Volusia County. And that just did not happen because of the environmental impact and the local community deciding that that environmental impact was not worth it. And then there was an effort in South Georgia, right on the coast of Florida, right on the border of Florida, I should say, to have a spaceport. And again, the local community decided that they didn't want the environmental impact. And not only that, the launches would have been over a populated island, and they didn't want that risk. And so when you're looking at places where there's airports, it's a little bit less resistance because there's already an airport, there's already air traffic. So that's for horizontal takeoff or horizontal landing. There's just so few of those vehicles, right? We've got Dream Chaser that's going to do a horizontal landing. But Virgin Galactic is so infrequent. They've paused or about to pause their launches. Virgin Orbit is no more. Pegasus, technically Pegasus still exists, but it doesn't really launch anymore. So it's just so infrequent that we have those vertical takeoff or vertical landing vehicles. So what we're really looking at is new areas where we launch horizontally, and there's so much resistance to creating that. Boca Chica, Texas was an exception. And I don't think it can be expanded the same way that Cape Canaveral is expanded, right? Cape Canaveral has a lot of land that's dedicated to many different parties. It's not going to be the same at Boca Chica. It's not going to be the same at Van Horn, Texas. You just can't replicate that. Not anymore. You might, again, I'm going to mention that you might want to do it off the coast. That might be the future, but we don't know. It's too early to say.
Right. Let me go back to one of the questions that was asked here, and it goes back to your company in a sense, but which is easier to work with, a billionaire-led space company or a government-led space company?
It depends on who you talk to, right? You're going to be working with the government either way. So the government regulates spaceflight. You've got the FAA that regulates launches and landings. You've got the Department of Commerce that's now involved. You've got the FCC that's involved. You've got NOAA, the National Oceanographic and what's NOAA stand for? Whatever. They're involved, right? There are government agencies that are involved, even if you are a completely private company that is run by a billionaire. So their difference is, there's pluses and minuses, and I have no direct experience to be able to compare. Like, it depends on what you mean by work with, right? So work with as in be a customer, work with as in like be a partner, like work with how, right? If you are wanting to launch something, payload on Falcon 9, that's super easy. They've got their rideshare missions, and you just integrate your payload with them. So like that's really easy. If you want to hitch a ride with NASA to the National Space Station, that used to be my job, is helping companies and universities to get a ride for their payloads up to space station through NASA, through the ISS National Lab. That's actually pretty easy, although there's a proposal process. You need to actually win the proposal and get the grant. It really just depends on how you are going about it.
Right. In terms of all these things that are happening with space, and I'll use the word new space or space 2.0 as our Ad Astra editor called it, Rod Pyle called it space 2.0. How do you see the whole dynamic change? And since you're part of consulting and getting people, helping people with jobs in the industry, how do you see it shaping up for the next generation coming out of college? The engineers and scientists who hopefully will get us to Mars?
Well, for one thing, it's no longer engineers and scientists. I don't think it ever was just engineers and scientists. We have to recognize that there's a diversity of people who are behind the scenes that are coming from all different backgrounds, and space is a business. And so you've got business people, you've got finance people, you've got communicators, you've got marketers. Space is also an umbrella term. So it's really not one space industry. It's really a collection of industries. So you've got all kinds of expertise that may or may not be technical, that come from different industries that operate in space or use space data. It is becoming more diversified, more global, and more open to possibilities, right? So traditionally, it's been more closed off. There's been limited access to space, and now we're seeing much more increased access to space at a smaller price point. There are people who think that this is going to completely change when Starship becomes operational, but I am hesitant to say that because Starship might not actually lower the price point very much because they don't have competition. They don't have necessarily a reason to lower their price point much more than it already is, but there is going to be increased capacity and increased, hopefully increased cadence. And so we will see even more access to space, which means, not just business for SpaceX, it also means business for all these other businesses that want to pop up and do science or tech development, R&D, a direct customer business with, telecommunications or, whatever it happens to be, Earth observation. There's so many things that could be done in space. And so when you're thinking ahead to what's the workforce going to be, it's going to be much more diversified, and it's going to be space is already taken for granted. It's going to be taken for granted even more because there are people who are using GPS data and other satellite data, and they don't even know it, right? They don't know that their harvester is automatically running off of GPS or other satellites. They don't know, right? So you're going to see that kind of diversification where they don't even necessarily care that their data comes from space.
Right, right. I read somewhere that around 70 different countries have some sort of space agency. And do you see that growth continuing? Again, not everyone can launch a rocket, but a lot of people want to have a space program to help their economy, help, satellites for communication, Earth observation, that type of thing. Do you see that trend continuing as well?
Absolutely, in multiple ways. So we have the formal space agencies, but we also have the commercialization of space. Some countries have actually established more of a space hub with commercial space before they even started a space organization, an actual government agency, like Australia comes to mind, for example. New Zealand was kind of started in a sense with Rocket Lab, and then they helped the government put in place all the necessary regulations and all of that. And so you've got that increase in the interest of developing some kind of agency or some kind of space hub for the business, for the leadership is also, this is especially in the Middle East, where they want to demonstrate leadership amongst themselves, right? And so you do have Saudi Arabia and UAE and others that are competing against each other to increase their space involvement, to have spaceports, to have astronauts because of that leadership potential. China is a huge area here. China is now maybe probably the number 2 player in the world in terms of space because they saw that potential of leadership. So now they've got allies that are going to be and already are using their space station, going to be using their lunar, their lunar base once they have that set up. So China has already been jumping on this and sees that potential. Another area is access for astronauts. So one of the things that I think surprised some people is that it's not necessarily wealthy individuals that are flying to space station and wanting to fly, commercially suborbital or maybe around the moon. It is government agencies that want to fly representatives of their own country. And so you see European countries that are getting around the ESA, the long ESA process of becoming an ESA astronaut and kind of putting in their backup players through Axiom Space through SpaceX. So as SpaceX flies them through Axiom Space to get to the International Space Station. And we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more countries say, I'm not going to wait for some formal process. I'm just going to buy a ticket through Axiom or through SpaceX directly.
Right. Let me get a couple questions that have come in. So Walter asks, is anyone working on rotating space stations to produce artificial gravity?
Yes. So a friend of mine started Gravity Lab, so that's one to check out. I believe that VAST has plans for this, and there's a company that changed its name like 3 times, so I don't know its name right now. But there's a company that's been around a while that is also working on artificial gravity. I apologize, it's gone under several names, and I can't think of what the current name is. But yes, there are companies working on this. Whether or not there are countries that are working on this, I'm not sure. I know that in the past, Japan has actually flown a small centrifuge on the space station, but I mean small. Nothing that's going to prove an artificial space station. So we just have to wait and see how all these little tests. I want to see this happen. Yeah, I want to see the money being put into it so we can have this happen.
And Carl asks, how will the U.S. coordinate its program with other nations like Russia and China?
So right now, there's something called the Wolf Amendment, which is renewed every year, that says that the United States cannot directly work with China on its space program unless it has authorization from Congress and the FBI. And so there are times that NASA has to work directly with China, but it's rare. And it does not seem like the Wolf Amendment is going to go away anytime soon. In fact, I think that its backing is only stronger now. So that unless there is a change in geopolitical policy on Earth, you're not going to see a change in geopolitical policy in space. It trails. So our geopolitics in space trails our politics on Earth. Another way you see this is Russia, right? So we have been working with Russia on the International Space Station, and we have worsening relations over the past 2 years since they invaded Ukraine, but space relations trail Earth relations. So we still see Russia being an International Space Station partner, but what we do see is they're not a partner on Gateway. They're the only partner from ISS that is not taking part in Gateway. And so that's just an example of how it takes time in space to get away from some of these partnerships or to create some of these partnerships that we see happening or worsening on Earth.
Just to answer Walter's question, yes, Walter, this will be recorded and it's going to be on our NSS YouTube site. So we'll let everyone know when the recording is available. There's an old joke I heard about how do you become a millionaire, and it was you start out a billionaire and you create a space company. What advice do you have for people who might be are interested in creating a space company? Because this is going to lead into my next questions about intuitive machines.
The financial climate is hard right now. The money was flowing in 2021 and then it stopped. It's still going, it's just harder. And so if you are interested in starting a space company, first off, go do it, but start with your business plan. Start with the foundations. You don't need to have like an entire formal business plan written up immediately, but you do need to have the foundations of one. Talk to your customers, talk to potential customers, see where that need is that you can fulfill. A lot of times it's the other way around, where we have a great idea, we have a product, we have a service, and then we try to fit that idea into the market, when in fact it should be the other way around. We need to be talking to the market, we need to be seeing what the need is, and then working our product or service around that. So this is actually something I help companies do, space companies, where they usually are run by an engineer and they usually have a brilliant idea, and I help them figure out, okay, who are your customers? Who are your competitors? And how do you actually get started with this? Do you want to get government funding? Because there's still a lot of government money flowing, especially through the Department of Defense. I don't know if you know this, but the Space Force has a larger budget than NASA. So there are a number of DoD entities that have money that is flowing to space right now. DARPA being another. I mean, like, there's just a number of agencies where you can apply for grants. Another one would be, of course, the pre-seed round, you know, making sure that if you have some means of getting money through colleagues, friends, family, etc., that you do start there as well. Because if you can convince the people at that level, then maybe you can have practice enough to convince people at the next level when you want to do a real big, your first real round. And then, of course, there's just the people who are kind of like doing it as a hobby, and then the hobby turns into a company. I would almost like call myself my company that category, where it was sort of a hobby and then it turned into a company. I don't necessarily recommend doing it that way, but that is a way, if you are a professor or you're working somewhere and you can legitimately work on the side, like there's nothing in your contract that says that you can't work on something on the side, that your company doesn't own the property rights or whatever, then that is an option as well. And you can spin off. Actually, universities usually have programs where they spin off companies from the university. So that is a good way to go as well. There are also accelerator programs, incubator programs, that kind of thing.
Sounds good. That leads into my next question about intuitive machines. A few weeks ago, they successfully landed on the moon. Odysseus, their Nova-C lunar lander. It's a company that didn't even exist before 2013. And, they became the first company to successfully land on the moon, and the first one since 1972 for the United States. Yet I saw some of the comments on social media, which disturbed me, that people were considering this a failure. I know it tipped over and they didn't get all the data, but it's still just an incredible accomplishment for a private company to carry this out. And what are we, what are we expecting from these companies? As I said before, the engineering design process, you're not always going to succeed, but you learn. And it sounds like they learned a lot by doing this. And I'm just wondering, I was kind of disturbed by it, the negative comments.
It's a difference in perception. Because there are some people who think, wow, we landed all these astronauts on the moon back in the 60s and 70s. Why can't a commercial company land a lander that's not even, crewed, right? So there's that perspective where unless it's 100% success, it's not a success. But then there's the perspective of these companies have never done this before. They're doing it on a tiny budget.
Right.
The budget is approximately 100 million. I actually broke it down in one of my newsletters a few weeks ago of the budget of Astrobotic, the budget of Intuitive Machines, the budget of some of these other CLIPS providers, CLIPS being commercial lunar payload services. By the way, you can go to astralytical.com/subscribe if you want to subscribe for the weekly newsletter. And the difference there is that it's a new approach, because not only is it approach for these commercial companies. It's a new approach for NASA. NASA is not building these. NASA is buying a service, and these companies are deciding on their own to go ahead and fulfill that service to build the lander in the way that they think is most appropriate. And it is technology development. And so they didn't put any super serious payloads on these first attempts with Astrobotic and Intuitive machines. They have in the next mission for Astrobotic, as of right now, they have a pretty big mission scheduled for Viper. Intuitive Machines has Griffin. No, that's not it. Griffin is the name of the Prime 1. I think that's it. So those are larger missions. Those are missions that will be a real loss to NASA if they are lost. So what they did is they contracted out for smaller payloads. They said, we understand this might fail. Actually, when they created CLIPS, NASA said that they expected about a 50% failure rate. So they created this program knowing that those missions are going to fail, probably initially, and then they iterate on. It's sort of like the conversation we started with an hour ago. SpaceX iterates on Starship. Intuitive Machines, Astrobotic, they're iterating on their lunar landers to the point where hopefully they can do this routinely, so that NASA can have an easy and less expensive way of getting payloads and instruments on the surface of the moon. And this also helps when you're thinking about human landers. So Starship and Blue Origin, Blue Moon, they are going to be landing humans. And you better believe that those two companies are paying attention to what the CLIPS providers are doing, because everybody in the community is learning through the failures.
Right, right. I heard one NASA official use the analogy of hockey. It's we take a lot of shots on goal and we expect a few of them to go in, but some of them don't. So I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but I thought it was interesting. A couple of other questions have come in. So I see a question from Carl, and maybe this ties into your book about off-worldly. What precautions can be taken to protect astronauts against radiation?
So this is an interesting question, because we have been operating space stations in low Earth orbit for decades now, not just ISS, but other ones before it. So we pretty much understand how to operate long-term within the protection of Earth's atmosphere, because space station is still somewhat in Earth's atmosphere, as well as, you know, some of the other space stations that have existed and currently exist. The question becomes when we get out of the protection of Earth's atmosphere, when we get away from our magnetosphere, when we start getting into deep space. And I think this is still an open question. So for Artemis 1, they had radiation sensors on their mannequins, their mannequin, adorable.
Right.
And I don't know. I am a physicist, but I don't pay attention to the radiation. Like, I'm not a biologist, so I actually don't know the results of that. Someone who knows better might be able to answer your question, because I know that they're looking at this. They're absolutely not going to risk human lives, because the idea is that we're not just going to go there for short sorties. We're going to go there with Gateway being in this weird orbit. We're going to go there for longer times, permanent lunar base. We're talking at least, you know, a decade out for a permanent lunar base. There's nothing really planned, like, concretely at this time, but that's what they want to try for. They want to try for radiation protection of the astronauts in deep space as well as the lunar surface. And the reasons why they want to do this in cislunar and lunar space is because they want to prepare for humans on Mars. We've been preparing for humans on Mars since 1969, since we landed Apollo 11. That's how long they've been saying Mars is next. And we just don't know enough to prepare for that. Radiation is going to be killer if we can't figure it out on the long journey to Mars. So everything we're doing here with Artemis in terms of the moon is applied directly to Mars.
You mentioned about all the different disciplines that will be involved in space beyond the technical. So Carl asked a question about who will be in control of legal aspects of space.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because we don't know. We don't have that system established yet. What we do have is the United Nations has a number of treaties, the largest one being the Outer Space Treaty, which was signed by 100 and something countries, all of the major spacefaring countries, including the United States. That was 1967. So while it is still something that we look to today, it is slightly outdated in that they didn't really anticipate commercial space back then. They didn't really anticipate commerce. And so what we have is now the Artemis Accords, which is run by the United States, run by the Department of Defense. It's multilateral treaties. We're up to, I think, 33. Oh, someone tell me if I'm wrong. 30 something signatories of that. So that's what we're looking at in terms of US leadership. But who's to say that there isn't other leadership such as China? China is not a signatory, Russia is not a signatory of the Artemis Accords. So how are they going to proceed with their laws? And what's to say there isn't a third country that starts to abide by their own laws and decides not to operate under the Artemis Accords or under the UN treaties? Or we don't have that set up yet. So this is an area that's still in development.
Right. Let me get Tim's question. Are there countries besides the US, China, Russia, the EU, and India that are developing their own launch vehicles? I know Zaire and Congo was working on it with a private company to develop a launch vehicle called OTRAG back in the 1970s. Are there any other examples?
Oh, I didn't know about that one. That's interesting.
Yes.
So when you're talking about uncrewed launch vehicles, yes, I know that the UK, Germany, yeah, I mean, obviously Japan still currently launches, and you just mentioned the incident that was yesterday. There's all kinds of launch vehicles that are uncrewed around the world. China has so many private companies, or private companies that are developing launch vehicles right now. If you're talking about crewed vehicles, if you're talking about launching humans, there's only 3 countries right now. There's the United States, China, and Russia. India is trying to develop that. They're not there yet, but they just chose their first 4 astronauts, so they're trying.
Wow.
We're just gonna have to see who comes up with that technology next to be able to do that. I don't think it's going to remain just 3 or 4 countries. I think that that's going to proliferate.
That kind of also, let's see, I see a couple other questions from Carl, but let me ask one that I think is you have a lot of background in. What thought should be given to space tourism? Where do you see that going?
This is one of my favorite things because this is where I see me someday flying to space, because I don't think I'm going to get that past the astronaut process through NASA. So someday I anticipate flying through commercial space process. So right now we do have space tourism. We've had it for about 20 years. So Dennis Tito flew in 2000 through a company called Space Adventures, working with Roscosmos, that's the Russian space agency, to fly to the International Space Station. And we've had several others fly to the International Space Station privately through either Space Adventures or Axiom Space in partnership with SpaceX. We've also had suborbital tourism. Suborbital tourism sort of is taking a break at the moment, where both Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic are sort of paused. Virgin Galactic, I think, is wrapping up their last flight that they plan to do this year with tourists before they take a pause for their next vehicle. Blue Origin had that incident on an uncrewed New Shepard, and that just caused them to just pause everything. So they had I don't really know when they're going to do their next crewed flight. I'll be honest. I'm not sure. They haven't said. And then we have the Cislunar and Deep Space, right? So we do actually already have private companies, private individuals that have booked Starship to fly circumlunar, or, we've got, so Inspiration 4 was a mission that flew on Dragon through Falcon 9. And then the same person, Jared Isaacman, he actually purchased additional flights through something called the Polaris program with SpaceX to fly not only on Dragon, but also on Starship. So we already have that mission for Starship. We have Dear Moon Project for Starship, and we have Dennis Tito and his wife who are going to fly on Starship. So the future is bright. I did already mention that countries, sovereign nations are going to want to fly their own representatives. So you can call that tourism or not. So they're going to want to fly commercially because there's so much more supply. High demand, limited supply, but supply is opening up. So that bottleneck is going to be a bit removed. If you call that tourism, maybe not. You're going to see not just rich individuals and countries, but you're also going to see more research. So I've got 2 colleagues of mine, Kelly Jordy and Alan Stern, who flew on Virgin Galactic. What was that? Not quite a year ago. When was that? That was fairly recent. And they did.
I think October sometime. Yeah.
Yeah. So that sounds about right.
It was about a week after
Halloween. She missed Halloween. She talked about how she missed Halloween with her daughter. So yes, so they did research, right? They were actually flown through their employers to conduct research on these suborbital flights. So we were going to see more of that as well.
Yeah, Alan Stern. I think he was flying a couple weeks after he was on our space forum.
Very cool.
Let's see. I got a couple other questions in here. Let's see. It's a comment from James. The treaty is not likely to affect habitats which must be registered to a nation and will likely be treated like a ship at sea. So just a comment there. Then I see a question from Brad. What is the best way to watch a rocket launch? Is there anything else space related that you suggest for a tourist in Florida?
Well, you all are lucky now because when I lived there, you know, it was not as frequent. So now when
Yeah.
you go, you're going to see one if you're there for more than a few days. You're going to see a Falcon 9 go up. So I find that to be a real advantage if you're going to go. Before you just have to like leave empty-handed if you wanted to go for a specific launch and then it got scrubbed and it wasn't going to launch for a while. Now you just go and you're going to see a Starlink or something fly. So you can see it pretty clearly from most places.
Right.
Anywhere along the water's edge is going to be good. If you get a chance to see it from up close, like, Kennedy Space Center or one of those locations, certain parks, I mean, those are great locations. I was there for Axiom 1. I saw it at the bleachers, the Banana Creek.
The Banana Creek, right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great place. That's an official setup. But there's differing advice about taking photos. There are some people who say just don't take photos at all. I'm of the opinion, take photos if you want, because I'm the one who, like, I love remembering things through the photos that I take, and it doesn't need to detract from your experience. Watch it with your own eyes, but go ahead and snap a photo if you want to, especially if you're a budding photographer. Like, that could just, some of the photography right now is absolutely stunning when it comes to the talent that we see amongst photographers launching, taking pictures of launches. Expect there to be hot days. Florida is hot. So bring water, to bring sunscreen, make sure you're in the shade or have some kind of hat or something to protect yourself. If it's a night launch, be careful of mosquitoes. The practicalities. There are guides out there. Have fun. I mean, like, really, like, how many people get to witness this era of human history where we are ramping up becoming a spacefaring society, like a spacefaring, species? Like, that is something that people in the future are going to wish they could come to this time to see that ramp up. Like, it is just a fun time to be alive.
Absolutely. And I vouch for that here in Florida. But if someone is planning to make a trip, I would definitely check out the Kennedy Space Center's website, because they do offer these. They changed how they do it. They used to call it Feel the Heat, and they used to charge $250 to go out to the Banana Creek viewing site. That included an admission to the Space Center, lunch or dinner, and some gifts. And they took a lot of heat for Artemis, and no pun intended, because you only get two chances, and then you have to buy another ticket and so for Artemis, they took a lot of heat related to that, people complaining, and they've changed it now. It's not Feel the Heat anymore. They now call it a transportation ticket, because some people already have a yearly pass. They're asking, why should I pay $250 when I already can get in? So now they only charge $70 to go out to the Banana Creek site. It's not for every launch. It's only during launch, during the business hours of the Space Center. But it's a lot better than spending $250, and especially if it doesn't launch. So I would definitely ask people to check the Kennedy Space Center website. They are doing it for the upcoming Delta IV launch on the 28th. And sometimes they actually you can go to the gantry, the LC-39 gantry, which is a great place to see a launch, because it's even closer if they're launching from Cape Canaveral. So, but as you said too, there are a lot of places just around the Space Center that don't cost anything, and you get great views. So definitely encourage people to make a trip.
Yeah, I've seen it from like a boat. I've seen it from a friend's balcony. I mean, like,
Yep.
even if you are, I know some people who live in other states who have seen it, have to go cram into Kennedy Space Center. You can really see it from a lot of places.
Absolutely. Let's get it. We're just about at the end of our time here. Let me see if I can get a few more questions in. I see Carl. Carl always asks a lot of questions.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. What has been done so far regarding the practical use of a space elevator? I don't know if you've done any work on that.
So I do know a man called Michael Lane who has been working on space elevators for quite some time. I know that there's been a work in Japan. I don't know of recent work. I do know that material science is just not there yet to be able to make this practical. It's a fantastic science fiction idea at this time, but I want to see it succeed someday. But I know that there's still a lot of work to be done on the strengthening of the fibers or using some other materials so that we can actually have the proper material that's going to be strong enough and stable enough to have that kind of a length.
And we had a great space forum a while back on space elevators. I'll have to share that with you, the link for that, so you can go back and look at some of the items of the technology that's being discussed. And Donald asked, will there ever be an orbiting hotel similar to the one depicted in 2001?
Well, I hope so, because I want to go there. So we didn't speak a lot about commercial space stations. There are currently 4 concepts that are funded by NASA to develop commercial space stations. We got Axiom, we got Orbital Reef, we've got, why am I blanking? Starlab. I said 4, I actually mean 3 because Northrop Grumman joined Starlab. And then there's other ones that aren't currently funded by NASA but have Space Act agreements with NASA. That's an unfunded agreement. So there is work being done on commercial space stations. That's not to say that they are for space tourism only. There's going to be research involved when NASA is an anchor tenant. There's also going to be, other organizations, especially, let's say, pharmaceutical companies or other types of business that's done, manufacturing on these space stations. But you better believe that there will be tourism and that it's going to be a enhanced experience compared to the ISS, which was never meant to be a tourist location. So yeah, I raise my hand as someone who absolutely wants to go on a space hotel someday.
I think that we can end with a good question. I think we asked you this when you gave your last talk here about when do you see the price point breaking? As you mentioned, countries are now funding people to go, researchers are funding people to go. But there's still a really high cost associated with that. I think the Axiom seat was around 50 million a person, something like that. I don't know if that's true or not. But do you see the price point breaking at some point, maybe 5-10 years, that make it a little bit more reasonable?
Yeah, but we're not talking 10 years. We're talking longer.
Longer.
Space is
Okay.
very expensive and space is often very delayed. And so you have to get to the point where they've recovered the costs of development and it's a good operational cadence. So they've got a routine down, right?
Right.
And we are not going to get there anytime soon. So I want to see that because, again, I want to fly personally, but I don't know when we're going to get to that point where it's affordable for you and me. Hopefully within my lifetime. That's all I can say.
Very good. With that, I think we'll close out then, Laura. So thank you so much. A very interesting discussion with you. And thank you for answering all those questions. As you said, we had a lot. But hopefully we can get you back again to talk about this in the future, because this is an evolving thing. And we're going to see a lot more changes and a lot more advancement as we move into later into this decade and the future. As we hope with what we're doing in with our ISDC, what we hope we're doing in NSS, that we're making a difference and making it a little easier for people. As we say, space is for everybody, and we want to make sure that happens. So thank you again. We really appreciate your time. Yep. And when your new book comes out, let us know. We can hopefully feature that.
Will do. Okay. Thank you so much for the audience too.
Absolutely. So also, as always, I'd like to thank my colleagues Larry Ahern and Fred Becker for all their support in putting together these space forums. And a special thanks to our CEO, Anita Gale, for joining us. So let me share my screen again as we just close out for the evening here. There we go. Let me get this up there. I've got too many things open on my screen here. Oops, there we go. Let's get it. Let me just advance here. So everybody, I just want to thank you all for joining us this evening for this Space Forum. I hope you can join us on Saturday morning. I know it's early for some of you, but it will be well worth your while to view some of the questions that come up from these incredible students at this Fun Debate Mentoring Forum. So again, you should see that invite in your email. Also try to grab it from, you can grab the link in the chat. So hopefully we'll see you there on Saturday morning. And if everything goes according to plan, we will have the next Space Forum on April 11th related to the ISDC, but there might be another one on the 29th. We're just trying to March. So I'm sorry, 28th of March. So keep a lookout for that. So again, thank you all for attending. For those of you in today's time zone, have a great evening. For those of you in tomorrow's time zone, have a great day. And for everybody, have a great weekend and stay safe. And till we see you next time, take care, everybody.
Hey, Bert, you